We now move to the next plenary session on addressing European and global financial challenges. This roundtable includes James Emmett, Group General Manager and CEO of HSBC Europe, Jean Lemierre, Chairman of BNP Paribas, Jeremy Lieberman, Managing Partner at Pomerantz LLP, Lena Mortinen, Director General of the Financial Markets Department at the Ministry of Finance of Finland, and Yves Perrier, Chief Executive Officer of Amundi, in a discussion that is being moderated by Géraldine Amiel, Paris Bureau Chief of Bloomberg. Please welcome them to the stage.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm absolutely pleased once more to moderate a panel and have to thank Arnaud Bresson for having invited me. It's an honor. I need to say, since I work from Bloomberg, that I'm pro bono. And the reason why I've accepted also to moderate this panel is that there's one woman beyond me, just one. That's mandatory at Bloomberg. If there's no woman, there's no panel. You hear that, Arnaud, for the next time. When we started to prepare for this discussion, it struck me that we would easily end up with a long list of hurdles, problems, issues, questions. In French, liste à la Prévert. Un inventaire, pardon, à la Prévert. And not to mention fears, so you name them. Tech, cryptocurrencies, terrorism financing, climate warming, social inequalities. Really vast a topic for such a short panel, 45 minutes only. So a good way to narrow the discussion a bit when we prepared it was to look at our closest environment. And this is a time when we have a new European Parliament. Hopefully we will have a new European Commission and a new head of the ECB soon. Brexit is looming. Some of you might have forgotten about it, and they could be forgiven for that. And some major European banks have been struggling to face the music. So it seemed about right to focus a little around Europe. And at the same time, when you talk about Europe, you talk about what surrounds Europe. So we will talk also about the United States. And we experience scorching heat, and we keep talking about sustainable financing. So I'm pretty sure we're going to touch a little bit on climate warming and the challenges it poses to the financial industry, and the role finance can play as well. And let me be very clear from the start, and as much as we discussed this, something that popped up is, as much as we perceive all the things that we're going to discuss as challenges, they seem to me as well as opportunities, or else this wouldn't be the financial industry, right? So with me to discuss this, I'm fortunate to have Lena Mortinen, Madame. She's the Director General of the Financial Markets Department at the Ministry of Finance in Finland. Thank you very much for being here. We also have James Emmett, who's a General Group Manager and CEO of HSBC Europe. We have Jean Lemierre. I need I introduce him, the Chairman of BNP Paribas. Bonjour, Monsieur Lemierre. We have Yves Perrier, CEO of Amundi. Bonjour, Monsieur Perrier. And last but not least, Jeremy Lieberman, all the way from across the Atlantic, is Managing Partner at Pomerantz. So let me kickstart this discussion. And here's my first question to you. The current administration, the current US administration is extremely busy rebalancing the way it perceived its relationship with the rest of the world in every possible field. Trade, geopolitics, defense, and I suspect at some point finance. Now, are you concerned, all of you, that there's a lack of proper level playing field and that it poses a strong challenge for the European industry, the European finance industry? James, please.
Look, I think it's a critically important question, but it depends on which side of the Atlantic you actually look. So if you're looking from the United States, of course, they're saying, well, European banks, undercapitalized. if you're looking from a European perspective, you're looking over and you're saying, well, actually, you've got a very different model. You've got Fannie and Freddie and different structures in place. And actually, if we then also look at what's coming down the line with Basel III and the implementation, we're actually going to end up with what should be substantially a level playing field in any case. So I think the key question for me is how do you actually make sure that many of the national exemptions, many of the underlying components are actually driven through, recognizing that there are a lot of, obviously, tensions in the political environment in its own right?
Yeah, it's actually a fascinating question. What is a level playing field when the systems are very different? So I completely agree with James on this, that it's something of a point of view. But it's clear, and I think it's been raised here in the panels, previous panels as well, that we do need the two components to work well together in Europe to have that level playing field and efficiency and profitability and adequate levels of capital put in place in the European entities as well. We need the banking union to be finalized, and we need a functioning, well-functioning CMU, the Capital Markets Union. And I guess the issue really is, what is the Capital Markets Union in these times? Because we've done quite a bit, but did we do the right things? But it has to be a full package in order to be saying that this is a level playing field, and there has to be more on the capital market side happening as well in Europe to be able to compete with US. I don't believe that we can just distort it on the banking side to be competitive. I think you need both.
Firstly, I think that when we look at the world, we have no doubt that the US are acting as a strong power. We have no doubt that China is acting with a strong power. The real question is that Europe need also to act as a power. And for this, it's necessary, firstly, that we go at the end to create a real capital market union, that we suppress the remaining fragmentation of the banking scene in Europe, and then define a commercial policy. I think it's one of the main stakes for the EC for the coming period.
Well, it's a difficult question you raise. This is a debate we like, but from time to time, I think that you have a level playing field if you deserve a level playing field. What do I mean by this? Economies are not the same. They are not funded the same way. It's not good or bad. It's a fact. It's a given element for us. And now we have to live up to what we want to deliver. Just to say, because this is a common view in Paris, that American banks are good in market activities. Of course, the United States market-based funding. So, of course, they are good. But this is not the reason why we are not good. What I mean is we can grow. And I go back to what you said. I think Europe is extremely is in a challenging time. We have started a massive reform with banking union and hopefully capital market union a few years ago, but we are not yet on the other side of the river. And it is up to us to deliver. And I hope that the new Commission will be extremely focused in delivering quickly some fruits, especially on banking union. And I will take one, that we do not see fragmentation. That there are many questions behind this, but this is a time for Europe to move forward.
Jeremy,
sure.
From your side of the Atlantic.
I think it's not a level playing field, but I think it's a unlevel playing field right now at Europe's selection. I could tell you that if you look, it's not a matter of superiority, as it says. If you look at the U.S. healthcare system, clearly, I think it's inferior to what's being offered in the EU. If you look at education and the affordability of education, EU is doing a better job. If you look at the financial sector, if you look at the economic sector, clearly America has a better system. And so really it's up to, in America you have right now on average about 3% quarterly growth. You have years sometimes, not recently, before the recession, 5% growth. You have in Europe, you hear about 0.5% growth, 1% growth, and this is a systemic issue and a systemic pattern. And there has to be a study and a real question as to why in America is clearly there's better growth, faster paced growth, and in the European Union it's very anemic. It has to do with regulation. It has to do with more business-friendly rules and regulations. Once that's addressed, it's up to Europe to level that playing field. Once it does, they can start to see very good growth as well.
You're rubbing the salt. So go ahead, Mrs. Martinen.
Thank you. I guess I have to promote a bit the fact that Finland has the presidency now of the Council of the EU. So we actually are quite keen on the topics that you raised. The 5-year agenda for EU is crucial now to have it put in the right sort of a situation, the Europe's competitive advantage to improve. And I must say that what I'm particularly interested is the CMU. I think there are a lot of advantages in the EU. EU is also running ahead with the sustainable finance that US is sort of lagging behind. So I think those are the things that we have to start pricing as a risk as well, which we have an advantage if we move fast, and that's what we are doing. But it's a challenge, and it's also a strategic challenge, because we are basically competing with the key inputs in the society that are needed by the companies. It's money, data, and energy that are strategically important. And money and data are interchangeable. So that's what I'm often wondering about. How good is the European banking sector and how good is the European financial sector in taking benefit of the data that they have available, because they are the oldest information machine available. And we are a bank-based economy so far. So the US system is different. We are bank-based. Whether the European banks could actually get benefit out of that, I would be very interested in hearing.
Mr. Emmett.
So the critical point here is that the European system is very bank-based. So 86% of financing comes from banks versus the US, which isn't quite inverted, but is sort of near enough to demonstrate the numbers. If we then look at the underlying aspects of that, and to the point not just of data, but we come back to the question that's been raised on Banking Markets Union, which is how do we create the pan-European scale? So then what do we need to do that? And where does EDIS come in? So a common deposit insurance scheme in whatever format it is. What else do we need to do? We have to tackle the latent NPL problem across the European Union. We've got to look at what a safe asset might look like in that context. And we need to end up in a structure where the Banking Markets Union can actually be taken to its final fruition. Because once you get to that point, actually I think you are then at a point where you do have banks that will be able not just to compete, and I think the European banks can do, I'm a very firm believer in that, but I think that you've got a point there where on a pan-European basis we've created a market which has many similarities to the United States in its capacity to compete on an intra-European basis.
So it's not going to be Europe versus US, I would like to point out. But as we decided initially to focus a little bit around Europe, there are so many challenges. And one that struck all of us, actually, is the low interest rate environment. For a long time, I'm turning to an asset manager. It's been an issue. It's been an ordeal. I mean, Amundi is the 7th largest in the world, but it's only the first largest in Europe. It's a very tough environment. So, do you want to speak a little bit about that challenge, Monsieur Perrier?
Sometimes I say that the policy of central banks is the worst policy except all the others. Because this policy of low interest rates permits to make sustainable the level of debt of some countries or some household, depending the countries. But at the same time, it creates a very challenging environment for the financial services industries. I mean banks, insurers, and asset managers. Because first, in the past, it had an impact of the level of the interest rate, for example, for mortgage loans in France. But now, the second wave will be on the remuneration of savings. If we want to let a decent remuneration of savings, considering the level of interest rate, we will have to adapt the level of fees. That means that the whole industry as a main challenge is to adapt, to industrialize, in order to have a level of cost which will be in line with the kind of remuneration that we can provide to our customers.
Mrs. Martinez.
Thank you. I fully agree that an environment where rates are so low is nearly impossible for banks. And of course, but it's a longer-term trend, this long-term rates coming down. Since the 1980s, they've been consistently coming down. I guess the problem is on the deposit side that you don't earn anything also in the short end, but the long end has made me wonder whether the business model, the old-fashioned business model of the maturity transformation is still viable if the trend continues. So, but it is a longer-term trend than just present central bank policies. And that's a question mark whether that would change in the future. Who knows what happens when we've moved from healthy globalization into geoeconomics, where basically all the economic policies are also always geopolitical as well, which makes this extremely difficult and challenging time. So central banking has perhaps turned a page a bit from what it used to be. But really the long-term trend is a question mark, and the bank's business models, whether they could survive on it.
Monsieur Lemierre.
Simply on this, a quick remark, because I am used to say that monetary policy should not be designed for banks, but must be designed for the economy, and we have to adapt. But what is the situation in which we are? It's quite clear for all of us. On one hand, the ECB wishes us to supply credit to the economy, to support the economy at a cheap cost. Fine. At the same time, they want us, and they are right, to be safe. It means that we need to have capital, and the capital requirements have increased quite a lot. And finally, they would like, when there is a difficulty, that we rebound quickly. I think the main specificity of the American system is capacity to rebound after a crisis. All of this has a simple conclusion, not the only one, but a very important one I want to mention. You cannot put a cap or ask for more capital requirements, wish credit, quick rebound, if banks are not allowed or don't have the possibility to shift their assets to other investors. And meaning to shift on a market base. And they are investors. My friend is an investor. He has a lot of savings, because in Europe we have a lot of savings. We could do it. There is a name behind this, which is securitization. And the whole securitization process in Europe, which has been reviewed once more, doesn't work. I'm sorry to say this. The level of securitization in Europe today is lower than before the crisis. At the time, there are investors willing to invest. So I insist on this. This is not a long story. This is a low-hanging fruit, which is the capacity to support the financial industry, to allocate assets according to the wish of the official sector. If we do not move quickly on the capacity to shift assets to various series of investors, we shall be stuck. So once more, I go back to the new Commission. That should be a low-hanging fruit, quickly implemented. Now, we can talk a lot about capital market union, but please let us speak about securitization first.
Jeremy?
I would just observe the low interest rate environment is really, it's a product of what we've been discussing before, is low growth. The interest rates mean is really what someone will give you money for, as opposed to invest it somewhere else, or as opposed to invest in the economy. And so if the rate of growth is low, and then they'll give you then therefore less money, or they'll charge you a negative rate in order to hold that money. And so really, it's back to the same problem in the United States. Also, is having lower growth. How do you come up with an economy that's going to have higher growth? If you had higher sustainable growth, you're going to have higher interest rates. And so really, interest rates is really just a symptom of the underlying disease in Europe and also in the United States as well. You do have lower historical growth even in the United States, and that is what's keeping interest rates low. And so solve that riddle on the economy, and you'll solve the riddle on interest rates.
There you go. Mr. Emmett.
I think just picking up on the earlier comments, it does mean that the industry in a lower income or rather lower interest rate environment, and let's not sort of try and predict how long that will last, but I think the point on the wider economic challenges is important, is going to have to adapt. And that means that the adaptation of the model will also have to take into account a number of the new contenders. We talked about technology in the last session, and a number of the new challenges. So I think you're going to see a fairly rapid evolution of some of the banking models to take account of, in fact, we're already seeing that, to take account of the lower interest rate environment amongst the wider economic and indeed geopolitical challenges.
So, among my list of hurdles, you just mentioned it actually. We have lots of savings in Europe, long-term savings. We have also a lot of debt, private and public debt. So my question is, one, that is way too substantial. The other is eluding the financing of the economy. In France, notoriously, the savers are keeping the money for themselves, in spite of many tax rebates that were granted by the current administration. Turns out that people are actually sleeping on the money. So what should be done? Isn't that another hurdle? Mrs. Martinen?
On the Capital Markets Union, I must say, I mean, it is a priority, but we are really grasping for straws in understanding what to do next. And I think the point about securitization is quite valid one, because of course, if everything is piled up in banks' balance sheet, it will have to be distributed elsewhere. But it's also a changing of culture, in a way that people that save money think about their own savings. And I know, I mean, Sweden is far away from us all because they've actually been able to develop quite a good, retail capital market attitude. But Finland, still people save through, buying a house or putting it in a bank. And that culture needs to change, and it takes more than us fiddling around with regulation. So this is a full-blown package of things that we have to get moving at the same time. And changing people's attitudes towards risk as well is in the center of it. And that's why this low-interest rate environment is difficult as well, because, people are not used to thinking about risk. Now they look for profits, but they look for safe assets at the same time. One has to understand that in order to get a return, you have to be able to and willing to carry a risk. And that's something that we haven't really been very good in bringing to the, regular savers' attention as well, that these products are slightly different than the deposits that they have at the moment. But it's a huge challenge. But as I said, I should give it to the gentleman representing the financial sector in giving the ideas of, in addition to securitization, what should be done next to get this moving.
Monsieur Perrier.
Well, there is a contradiction in this policy on interest rate, because on the one hand, it's support the economic development, but on the other hand, I think it prevents a good allocation of savings. Because when your savings, you consider that the remuneration of the savings is not sufficient, is not in line with the risk, what you do? You let the savings in free risk products, free risk rates, deposits, and so on. So I think that the monetary authorities will have to find the good balance on this question of level interest rate. There is, to a certain extent, it's an additional insurance, but above a certain extent, it can become something which is, create anxiety. The second problem in Europe is linked to the kind of area where are the savings. The most of the savings in Europe are in insurance companies. Insurance companies are submitted to a regulation which is solvency, which is not favorable at all to invest in equity, the requirement of equity when you compare to the US. And the consequence of this is that 6% of the savings of European individuals are invested in equity, when it is 30% in the US. And in the reason of the difference of growth in the countries, my intuition, my guess is the fact that this is an important point.
Mr. Emmett?
So I agree entirely, and I think addressing some of the Solvency II aspects associated with investments, not just in equities, but also how do you actually start thinking about SME investment and actually putting the money through into SMEs is critical. I'm not sure, I fully agree with the comments actually on culture, because I'm not sure this is actually about legislative framework anymore. I think it's how do we create the momentum now to get that investable class understood by investors more widely. And that is going to be a challenge for industry, for government, for multiple parties. But I don't necessarily think it's looking specifically at the framework other than completing the CMU aspects that we've already talked to.
So here's one down. We talked at length since the start of the day about the green economy financing, and I understood you had an interesting episode this morning. But nevertheless, as we are looking at the whole list of all the challenges that are posed to the global and European financial industry, this is one. I mean, how do we embrace the climate warming era? How do we embrace the social pressure that stems from this environmental protection need? How do we face it? How do we sort of not go for greenwashing, which I understood was actually what the protester was about? And how do we actually join the whole movement? Or should we, while we were preparing this panel, Mr. Lieberman had a very interesting anecdote, and I would like to share it with you. CalPERS, the fund, actually has come of late under pressure by some investors because over the past years it turned down investments in guns companies, in industry, old industry companies, energy companies, and favored rather what would be understood as sustainable investment. And for some investors, it actually dented their yields or actually their returns, if I'm right, Mr. Lieberman. So here's the type of pressure I'm talking about. Should CalPERS keep doing so, even though it's going to be faced with accusations that it's not serving its investors or its customers? Or should we ignore? Should we move on? Are we going to be the villain here, and be sort of not proud about it, but hey, that's life, going to be cynical about it? Or how do we face this challenge? And it's a mighty one, really. Mr. Lieberman.
I would just, to a certain degree, a lot of the what we see in going in Europe on the ESG investing, I mean, it is very important, ESG principles, and to consider that investing. It can sometimes be taken too far, and it can be done in a way where, in a sense, the investment manager is becoming the arbiter of morality. And really where their job is, they're supposed to be in the business of making money, not in the business of passing moral judgment. And so what I would say is certainly it does make sense for an investment manager to be investing in things that has good social purposes. But I would really define those very discreetly, and it really can become a slippery slope. Just for example, clearly guns are bad, so we could agree on that. Another question, maybe, I mean, we all know how Facebook and Google makes their money. It's no surprise. What they do is they take people's personal information and sell it to others without telling the people that they're whose information they're taking. Should we stop investing in Google? I mean, that would sound preposterous, but if you take that to its logical conclusion, you would. Oil. A lot of people say, well, we obviously don't like diesel engines, but oil, people say, well, oil will be out of business in 20 years. Really? I don't know. If you go to the United States and you go to the shale regions where they're doing fracking, there is enough oil to sustain the United States and potentially large, vast parts of the world for 100 years. And so all I would say is with ESG concepts is they're important concepts. They have a very valuable, important role. It can sometimes look like on a whole host of issues that the investment manager is passing judgment on issues where maybe it's not their place to pass judgment. Let the government do it and let the money managers do what they're supposed to do, which is to make money.
No, I fully understand that. But then again, as you mentioned, I mean, that's why we have the regulation and that's why we have government policies to react to the selfish, inclinations that we tend to have as individuals, or the short-termism that some of us suffer from, that wanting to have the returns now rather than thinking about the future. And that's why the governments come to play. But I fully agree on the point that we can't save this only on the financial sector side. This is not only about sustainable finance, it has to be more holistic. It has to have the government policies wider changed. Taxation, subsidization of what is brown rather than green has to come to play as well. And that's why I think it's also, as everybody knows, it's a global action. So it's not only what we do on sustainable finance in Europe, it's also, for example, the ministers of finance, the global coalition on climate change, to try to stop that together, sharing the best practices. This is much bigger than just a group of countries like EU or even China and EU. It has to be wider, and that's why I'm happy that it is also discussed in a wider context.
Firstly, I consider that it's normal in a world which has been liberalized that all the actors implement a responsible policy, including investors and financial actors. At the same time, we have to distinguish the responsibility. The responsibility of governments is to define the main line, because they have the legitimacy for that. They have been elected. And taking, for example, the question of the energy transition, it's not to the finance sector to define the price of CO2. It's not to the finance sector to define what has been to be a nuclear, not nuclear, and so on. But the finance sector has a responsibility to accompany the direction defined by the governments. But it's very important to distinguish the two roles, because sometimes we see that the governments are saying to finance sector, you have the responsibility to do this. I think it's not good, and it could be dangerous, because we can lead the people believe that we are able to do things that we are not able to do. We can accompany public government, and we are committed to do this, but governments have to define the key lines.
Yeah, a few words on this, because I agree on the remark that there is a debate about who is in charge and how to do. When I was young, I would have seen this as a policy matter for governments. And the banking industry would have had to respect the guidance given by, especially in a country like France, with state-owned banks. And that was it. The world has changed. And definitively, the financing world has a responsibility. We cannot say we don't care. That I do not agree. And if we were to say this, many protesters would come up front and say that they don't agree. Because I understand your remark about some clients, but we have also clients who don't want. We finance coal. And that's a serious debate. And in the long term, the sustainability of the activity of the business has a lot to do with this. So we have no choice. We are part of the story today. So we need to engage with policymakers, and policymakers should provide us guidance, that's for sure, and they do. And, but we need also to take responsibility for what we do. And it has changed a lot. And there is a very good example, which is coal. Now, to this, I would like to add one element. One of the difficulties is about the timing. In fact, when we engage with industries, we tend to say, okay, we hope you will reduce your activities for instance, on coal. And of course, clients or NGOs would like to say, no, you stop immediately. I think the difficult part is not so much that we are part of the story, but it's the way it is managed over time. And that's probably an area on which we need the more cooperation with governments to understand what to do and to do it in a timely way. And let's be clear, not hurting other policies such as employment. France is a country in which this is very well known. Part of the yellow vest story is about this. I think everybody could agree that the targets were good, but some people didn't accept at least the timing. So we have probably to develop new skills, new discussions with NGOs, with governments, with the EU Commission, with the EU presidency about how to do it over time. And on that point, Europe is still quite split. And that's probably a key challenge for the years to come, to put people together and to agree. Now, some people will not agree, some people will wish different things, but the mainstream is clear. We have to make what we do more sustainable. I have absolutely no doubt. Society has changed. There is a request. And when I look at the last elections to the EU Parliament, the participation rate is very high. Why? Because young people went and voted. But why did they vote? They vote for sustainability. I think that's a very clear poll. We have no choice. This is what we need to do. And you know, in Paris now, we have a famous say, which is en même temps. So we have to finance and at the same time be sustainable.
You agree, Mr. Emmett? En même temps?
So I couldn't agree more. But I think actually there's a particular word that was used a lot there, society. And actually a lot of this comes down to societal purpose from the financial system and the acceptance of the societal purpose. And working with government, how do we do en même temps the activities that you've outlined, but actually make sure that we have the initiatives that allow us to help drive where we can the greening, not just of the financial system, but the greening of the economy. And so ultimately the interlink for me between societal purpose of the banking system and indeed sustainable financing is critical in its own right. But I think we all need to be very clear. This is an initiative between the financial system, between government, between society writ large.
Just a quick comment on that. Completely agree, but not to forget what the role of the financial system is for the society. It's the efficient, accurate pricing of risk. And it comes back to understanding the phenomenon and being able to price it correctly, and then the markets as well being able to come together on this. So it shouldn't be distorted, and it goes back to the data. How do we know, how do we measure this, how the risk modeling is being done? And that's a huge challenge, but we just have to take it on.
I think that's a very important remark. I think we are shifting from, honestly, the acknowledgement of this to the measurement of this. And that's a new phase, shifting from emotion to rating. When I see that a non-financial agency like Vigeo has been, the control of Vigeo now has been taken by Moody's, it's a very, very important signal that measurement is about norms and standards. Norms and standards are about priorities. I see Michel Prada here, who has spent so much time and dedication to the accounting standards, and he knows better than I what it means. And we are shifting to green standards. And I hope that Paris will be the leading place where this is thought through and implemented. This is a key challenge for each of us in the room, that we are good at measurement this impact. There's no choice. Let's do it.
Monsieur Perrier, you want to say something?
I think that the movement is very fast, and we see the shift from institutional investors in the recent period to integrate this ESG criteria in addition to the traditional financial criteria analysis. What I want to say, the fact that sometimes some oppose, integrating ESG and the financial criteria. When we are on a long-term view, there is no opposition. And recently we have published a study about this, saying that the companies with good ESG rating had at the same time the good financial performance. So behind this question, we have also to promote a vision of long-term view on this. And as investors, I would say that most of the investors in the world are long-term investors because this money is generally for retirement and so on. And one of the problems of the finance industry is the fact that, let's say, in the 90s or the beginning of 2000, it was short-term investors, which are useful, but we have been dominated. And what we have to say is to put again, as we say in French, l'église au centre du village, the church at the center of the village, and mean that the long-term investor has to taken again, the power, the grip on the financial industry.
We needed to talk about fragmentation. We were supposed to talk about litigation, and the clock is striking noon. Let me recap a little bit what was discussed. As we talked about that topic, initially it became like US versus Europe, and it shouldn't be like that. But Mr. Emmett and Madame Mortinen pointed out that actually it's very difficult to talk about the difference of level playing field between the two sides of the Atlantic because the systems are very different. And Mr. Lieberman came a little bit to rub the salt in the wounds when he actually listed all the achievements of the US economy and the US financial industry. Thank you very much, Mr. Lieberman, for that. Ouch. Monsieur Perrieux said absolutely, no doubt that the US and China are acting as strong powers, and now Europe must also do the same. And we talked about the real capital market union as being another challenge. As we came into this challenge thing, it became more of what we need to do. So let me list it. We need a new commission that should be focused on delivering. It's time now that Europe moves forward. According to Monsieur Le Maire, we need. Let's not forget. Forgive me. That the focus is money, data, and energy," said Madame Mortinen, and Mr. Emmett said we need to get to a point that the CMU actually takes us to fruition, and we're, I think, a little bit far from that. Monsieur Perrieux said, of course, we might need different policy from the central banks, as we talked about the low interest rate environment. Do we need a new business model, wondered Madame Mortinen. Monsieur Le Maire agreed. Yes, we do. We need banks to have the possibility to shift their assets, so we need to move on securitization. As Monsieur Le Maire said, and insisted for the new commission that it's the low-hanging fruit. Monsieur Lieberman mentioned again once more the equation to solve the economy. It supports a low interest rates environment, is indeed seen initially as detrimental to the finance industry, but it also supports the economy. And here's a tough equation to solve as we need to support the economy. Mr. Emmett mentioned about adapting the model to technology, and actually said that we are seeing currently a rapid evolution of the banking models. Mrs. Mortinen, as we moved to savings and high debt, said that we also need a change in culture, probably, here in Europe, changing people's attitudes towards risk. We came back a little bit on the low interest rates with Monsieur Perrieux, who said that we also need to think about the fact that 6% is invested in equities, of savings are invested in equities in Europe. It's 30% in the US. So coming back to a change of culture, probably. We talked also about the green challenge. You've heard a lot about it throughout this morning. Mr. Lieberman here from his side of the Atlantic wondered if we had gone too far, or if this is going too far. Should moral values be part of an asset manager's thinking? Or should we stop investing in oil, in GAFAs? You mentioned Google and Facebook. These are important concepts, of course, and you see a social pressure. And this is why, actually, Madame Mortinen said, this is why we need, regulations and governments to act upon this. She mentioned taxation, too familiar a topic here in France, or in Europe, actually, subsidization as well. We need to implement reasonable policies, said Mr. Perrier, but we also need to turn to politicians. And Monsieur Lemierre couldn't but agree, said that the governments have to define the policies, but we need to engage with them. And what Monsieur Lemierre said, we also need to engage with NGOs, we also need to engage with all the stakeholders. And as the world has changed. And let me have this final note as we moved on to the efficient and accurate pricing of risk. This is what the European culture should move to, according to Mr. Mortinen. Let's not forget what finance is about, but it's also a new era. So we're done with the acknowledgement. Now it's about measuring it, and it's about embracing what comes next. So many challenges we haven't talked about, but in any case, I've been very fortunate to have you on my panel. Madame Mortinen, Monsieur Lieberman, Monsieur Emmet, Monsieur Lemierre et Monsieur Perrier, un très grand merci.
Thank you.